America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View. We're going to be covering, as you might imagine, over the next 2 hours, a number of different topics. Primarily, the focus in the first hour will be on what we would call democratic capitalism. Next hour, we'll go to our good friend, Dr. Paul Barreca, happens to be in town because he's involved in a missions conference at Dallas Theological Seminary. We're going to talk about the Great Commission. We'll also spend some time talking about the trip to Greece we're taking and a number of other things that we will get into that I think you will appreciate as well. Let me just, before I get into this, yesterday we ended by saying, okay, will the House of Representatives pass the continuing resolution called a CR? And it passed just barely, 217 to 213. All but one Republican voted for it. All Democrats voted against it. And of course, you've heard me talk about the fact that if you vote against it, we run out of money at the end of the week, and that would mean a government shutdown. So not only do we not have Democrats wanting to stand for some of the things at the State of the Union address a week ago, you couldn't find one Democrat, at least in the House of Representatives, that wanted to vote to prevent a shutdown. Now it goes to the Senate. We have 53 Republicans. Going to have to see if we can find 7 Democrats at least that don't want a shutdown in order to invoke cloture, which would be ending the filibuster. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But I am privileged to have in studio with us today Bruce Shaw. I mentioned yesterday he would be with us. He is the executive director of the Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism, which is at Georgetown Law School. Might hold up, for those of you watching online, one of their monographs, which is very well done, on industrial policy. We may talk about that soon enough. Is an individual that before going to Georgetown was a managing director at FCLT Global. He also worked for other companies. You can see his entire bio there as well. Had a degree in mechanical engineering from Texas A&M, his MBA that comes from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College, and I am so grateful that you can join us in studio.
Thanks so much for having me, Kerby. It's great to be here.
We certainly want to talk about this issue, and as a matter of fact, as you know, and I was even holding up our little booklet here on democratic capitalism. We quote a number of individuals, but one of those is Arthur Brooks, who says, you know, there are a lot of people that do believe in capitalism. It's about 70%. It's about a 30-70 nation. Almost 70% of all people believe we're better off in a free market economy. The problem is the bad news, 30% of them, up until recently, have been in control of the government, which is one of the reasons why I think the Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism is necessary. I do believe that many of the people in the White House and in the cabinet right now believe in capitalism. But you've seen the other numbers, because I'll hold up this little booklet on socialism. The younger you are, the more likely you are to think socialism is better than capitalism. And that maybe explains why you have the Denny Center. Go on.
Well, sure. So capitalism, certainly among the younger generation, has a relatively negative, image tied to it these days. And thinking about quotes about capitalism and socialism, I think it was Winston Churchill who said, well, 2 things Churchill said. The first was capitalism is about the unequal sharing of blessings, yes, while socialism is about the equal sharing of misery. And he went on to say that capitalism is also kind of the best option we have out of some pretty bad options of organizing an economy. So admitting that it wasn't perfect and had some issues, but also obviously a fan of the system and what it's done for humankind over the last just 200 years.
Human flourishing is really something very significant, and you can go back to even individuals who would not be, by any stretch of the imagination, considered right of center, that are still acknowledging. Bono the other day is a good example of that, saying, you know, really, I got to admit that the reason we have been able to drive and pull so many people out of poverty is due to a free market. Yeah. So obviously we recognize the fruits of that, but there are always the moral and legal and other kind of ethical concerns, which we'll get in just a minute. But tell us about the center for just a minute, because I have heard about it. I've heard about you. It's the first time I've met you face to face.
Yes.
But I want to introduce you to our audience, because some people might say, we need to do more. I see these kids coming home, even my own kids coming home from college, and they're just convinced that the answer is Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. What about this?
Well, so the Denny Center was founded by James and Catherine Denny. Mr. Denny was a graduate of the Law Center back in 1960. And the mission of the center is to reconcile the benefits of market capitalism with the values and needs of a democratic society. So how do we manage the tension, right? So the system we've acknowledged is not perfect. And how do we work together to really, with open eyes, talk about what some of its shortcomings might be, but also not forget how much it's done for us.
Yes.
And will do. Yep.
And again, it seems to me that that's kind of the problem. You know, when Karl Marx put together his theory about socialism and ultimately communism, he had something going for him, because he could actually look at the problems that had developed, especially with the Industrial Revolution, and point to certain flaws in what might be considered a free market, although I don't think that we've ever had a truly free market. But okay, let's just acknowledge that for a minute.
Right.
And he could compare that to this utopian idea of socialism. Now, if you go through the list and this little booklet on that, especially from Dinesh D'Souza, talks about at least 24 different countries that have tried socialism, and they've all been a tremendous failure. And sometimes when people rightly criticize corporate capitalism and all sorts of corporate culture, which you talk about in some of your monographs and all that, or the incestuous relationship between big business and big government, all that, those are all valid criticisms. But the bottom line is they're using that to then say, well, then the answer is socialism. And we know that doesn't work very well.
And I forget who said it, but if we don't take good care of our current economic system, and it fails for some reason, we're not going to like what takes its place. So to your point about socialism, I think one of the thought experiments is just picture yourself being made or put in control of a small town and having to make all the decisions about how much bread we're going to need tomorrow, how much gasoline we need down at the filling station, how many soft drinks we need at the local restaurant. It's mind-boggling what the market solves for us that we wouldn't solve nearly as well ourselves.
When you go to a store, you're essentially buying a product, and you're sending an economic signal down the line that says we need more of those. And anybody that's been in a big box store, whether it's a Walmart or even some of these huge grocery stores right now, or going to Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, as soon as you make a purchase, they already know at that store that they need to order another one. But all the way around the country and all the way around the world, it's sending all sorts of invisible signals, which Adam Smith called an invisible hand, to say we need to produce more of those, right?
Exactly. And when I think it was Boris Yeltsin, when he made a visit to the U.S. back in the 80s, the one stop on his agenda that kind of threw everything off kilter was a grocery store. Because he couldn't believe that, number one, the shelves were full, and number two, there was so much variety of everything, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so right on.
I did a commentary on that a while back. It's interesting you brought that up, because it was just down here near Houston in which that took place. And he said even the richest people in Russia do not have access to what the average American has when he or she walks into a grocery store. So when we come back, we're going to talk more about this idea of democratic capitalism, and we'll get into some of the critiques and some of the thoughts. Also, their new monograph on industrial policy, and that gets us into all sorts of things, including for our listeners out there in California, high-speed rail. That hasn't turned out quite so well. So we have a lot to talk about today. Bruce Shaw with us. He is, again, the executive director of the Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism. You can find out more about him, about the center, and about, of course, Georgetown Law on the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Healthcare officials warned that vaccine hesitancy is one of the top health challenges of this decade. It appears that both sides of the vaccine debate seem to be painting with too broad a brush. Most parents routinely have their physician give their child an MMR vaccine. At the same time, those same parents may express concerns about giving their child the COVID-19 vaccine. Unfortunately, they are often labeled anti-vax and blamed for the latest measles outbreak in the U.S. It is true that the percentage of children receiving 2 doses of MMR vaccine dropped a bit, but there are other factors such as the measles spreading from unvaccinated travelers or even undocumented immigrants. Parents who vaccinate their children but express concerns about the COVID vaccine should not be called anti-vax. Likewise, parents shouldn't refuse all vaccines simply because of the legitimate concerns about the COVID vaccine. By now, you may be wondering why I say there are legitimate concerns with the COVID vaccine. Well, a recent Yale study has confirmed what many suspected and has been referred to as post-vaccination syndrome. The COVID vaccine in a small number of people may have led to a constellation of side effects. These include fatigue, exercise intolerance, brain fog, and dizziness. Some people show distinct biological changes in immune cells, reawakening of a dormant Epstein-Barr virus, and the persistence of a coronavirus protein in their blood. While this is just a small study, it highlights the potential health concerns and calls into question the efficacy of the COVID vaccine. That is why many parents are concerned about the vaccine and why some states have banned vaccine mandates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Bruce Shaw. He's the executive director of the Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism at Georgetown Law. And again, occasionally he's going to give an opinion, and he is representing himself, not, of course, any of the professors or administration there at Georgetown Law. I think you understand that only so well. But I thought for just a minute, we just went to a break, and that's oftentimes when, for many of the stations, they hear my commentary, although it's heard on about 600 stations apart from the Point of View broadcast. And yesterday it was on socialism, interestingly enough, and it had to do with the fact that John Stossel, you know who he is, has actually done a video in which he said, where have some of these ideas come from? And obviously some of these ideas about socialism come from university professors, they come from some politicians and from various groups around the world. But another source, which he's talked about, is social media. And he goes on to places I don't really spend a lot of time, like TikTok or YouTube or whatever, and these social media influencers making some pretty outrageous statements, unbiblical statements, inaccurate statements, but nevertheless, and he did give a critique of that, so that was my commentary yesterday. But it's an illustration that we really are going to have to come back and talk about the value of a free market at a time when more and more young people are convinced that they would rather live under a socialist regime. 53% in one Rasmussen poll of those who are younger, 30 and under, 53% said they would actually like to live in a socialist country. I'd like to send them to one just so they can see what they thought about that. But nevertheless, that's why the Denny Center exists in the first place, isn't it?
It does. And it was created, as I mentioned earlier, to manage and take a real clear-eyed look at the tensions, right? So there's this idea that the free market and capitalism produces wealth and innovation and has, just look at what the average lifespan, for example, was in 1820 versus what it is today. But at the same time, it does create issues or perceived issues that we need to address. So it could be income inequality that people talk about. It could be how do we steward the environment better or differently. It could be corporate greed and scandal. So I think combined with a general distrust or growing distrust of institutions more generally, younger generations are just really skeptical about the current system in place.
Let's talk about some of the moral ones. One of those is that people say, well, when I read Adam Smith, and I did have to read Adam Smith, most people never have read The Wealth of Nations, but his argument is that it was not the altruism of the butcher, the baker, or the brewer, but as they were seeking their own self-image, they are led by an invisible hand to bring about it, and they didn't really intend, but it helps individuals, and that is the only way in a truly free market that you can get people to buy your good or service is to have one that is less expensive and more efficient. But the argument is sometimes, well, yeah, but that's self-interest. And I would argue, but I'd love to hear your comments, self-interest can be different than selfishness. Yes, a lot of people that go into the corporate world, and you've worked in the corporate world, are greedy people and selfish people. But whether they're selfish people or self-interested people, whether they're altruistic or not, it's a system because it's so decentralized in which bad people can do least harm and good people have the freedom to do good work. And it seems to me that if you want to have a system that provides the greatest amount of freedom and certainly provides the best number of goods and services at a cheaper price, a truly free market, and I keep saying that because we don't necessarily have that today, would actually be the way in which to achieve that, don't you think?
Well, and you mentioned invisible hand, and what's interesting about Smith, and I haven't studied him, I was an engineer, as you mentioned, I think earlier, but I'm getting to know him better now. The invisible hand only showed up once in The Wealth of Nations,
yes.
that phrase. And he did mean it as a sort of we hear a lot, and I just talked about some of the negative externalities that businesses can create. Right. But when he thought about the invisible hand, it was the positive externalities that our self-interest can generate. And you're exactly right. Self-interest is not the same thing as selfishness. He would not have defined it that way. Self-interest is just our natural tendency as human beings to think about, gee, I need something to eat, or I need to take care of my kiddos, or whatever it might be, where selfishness has kind of a negative connotation toward another person.
Right.
So self-interest is more first things first almost.
Well, and again, if you read another one, again, when I went to another Georgetown, which was, of course, a degree in American government, when we were reading some of the philosophy, you had to read Moral Sentiment, the Theory of Moral Sentiment by Adam Smith. You realize he wasn't talking about selfishness, but that is kind of one of the moral arguments. But you've raised some of the other political arguments, and that is, does the free market lead to externalities? And externalities mean this, that the cost, which is external to the firm, is put out there. And the classic illustration would be pollution. And is it maybe a problem with the free market that in pursuing profits, these particular externalities then just go into the air or the water? I think, first of all, as a Christian, I come back to say Romans 12 and Romans, a couple of other passages, certainly in Romans 13, really get us into this whole idea that, yes, there is a role for government, regulation to prevent pollution and all that. But I think you can even sometimes constrain the market in such a way that it's in the best interest for a corporation to clean up the pollution. And unless there's corruption, which sometimes there's been, I think that's a way to answer that really significant, and it's one of the biggest questions and arguments against capitalism.
No, you're exactly right. And Smith had a pretty strong view about government involvement in commerce. He of course, he was writing at a very different time than we live in today, kind of right in the heart of the Scottish Enlightenment when he was writing. And so although he's often cited to be against government, he really just was for limited government where it really makes sense, just like you're outlining. And so he would not be against basic regulation, enforcement of private property laws, et cetera. He just was, I guess, wary of government involvement growing in a way that's not intended. Mm-hmm. And so I think, just to kind of bolster that point, he actually, the last 10 years of his life, you may remember, actually served in the customs office there in Edinburgh. So he was a government employee himself. At
So
the
he
end of his life.
saw government as helpful, and I think that's the answer to that one as well. But a lot of people certainly raise that. You raised up another one, and that is actually in your monograph, and that gets into the disparity between the rich and the poor, which I quite frankly will argue has gotten much worse because of the pandemic and the lockdown and a number of other things. But even there, you keep track of what's called the Gini index, Gini. I've written about this before, and you've got a very interesting chart there. Still, even though we recognize that, for example, Elon Musk, richest person in the world, makes billions of dollars. The average person working maybe as a social welfare worker makes $30,000 a year. And we might say, well, that doesn't seem fair, but again, we allow people to use their gifts. Or another example, Steph Curry makes $30 million a year, and he makes a lot more than $30,000 a year as a social worker. But a social worker doesn't have the athletic gifts that he has. So we recognize that in a free society, you're going to have some people that are going to do better than other. They're different gifts and different callings, going back to 1 Corinthians 12, for example. So that makes some sense. But even though we hear a lot about this idea of wealth inequality, in some respects, even the poor do better in a free market than they do in a socialist society. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. And one of the things that's harder to measure, so you can actually look at something like the Gini coefficient or some of the other quintiles of income over time and kind of get a feel for real and perceived income inequality. But one of the things that's harder to measure is economic mobility. So we mentioned that in the report as well. And I think that's to your latter point, where we are in a place, we still believe that the market economy gives more opportunity, albeit not perfect, but more opportunity for folks to move up in their economic or their, kind of the wealth range. And I think the latest data we have on it came from the studies looking at generations in the 50s and in the 80s. And generations in the 50s, about 90% of those folks did better than their parents. In the 80s, it was about 50% of the folks who did better. So the American dream is still there. It's just maybe slowing down a little bit.
Well, and that could be down to regulations. It gets us into a conversation maybe we'll have after the break on tariffs, because that's been an issue there as well. Also, I thought it was kind of interesting when we were talking about this idea of the environment. Right now in Colorado, Democrats have proposed a $20,000 fine for gas stations that don't warn their customers about climate change. You cannot make some of this up, but nevertheless, we recognize that we have a society sort of going in two directions. Some people saying, let's have a freer economy, let's have fewer regulations, let's really cut loose the entrepreneurial spirit. And then you have others that want to find people because they didn't tell the person that is putting gasoline in their car that if they do that, they're going to actually create climate change and make it worse. Anyway, we have lots to talk about. Bruce Shaw in studio. Let's also open up the phones, give you a chance to join the conversation. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Come back. I'm going to talk a little bit about his website and also make some announcements about some things you need to know about. All that coming up right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry. And yet, there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes, even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that is 1-800-351-1212. Get to your calls if you would like, but I think many of you might want to just sit back, take some notes, learn a little bit. And we have been making available my booklet on socialism, but I might also offer the one on capitalism and socialism because these are great resources for you. We can send it to you in digital form, which is probably the easiest. Just give us your email, or we can send you a printed copy if we still have those available. We do have a link to the Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism. I would recommend that you follow the link because otherwise you have to go to law.georgetown.edu/Denny/center- and that's complicated. So you can go there and find out a little bit more. You can find out more about Bruce. You can find out about some of the research that they are doing. They are a 501c3, so you certainly could contribute to that organization. You might have Bruce or other people come and speak if that is something maybe you'd want to have for a Chamber of Commerce meeting or something of that nature. And we'll take some phone calls in just a minute, but I thought I'd make a quick announcement, and that is over the next couple of months, I'm going to be at a number of radio stations. One of those is at WPEO in Peoria, Illinois, and they have their 55th anniversary of that station, and I'm the speaker, well, I'm one of the speakers anyway, at that event, and I would love to meet you. And so you can go to their website, WPEO.com. And certainly if you're in the central Illinois area, certainly if you live in Peoria or anywhere nearby, can I encourage you to get a ticket? And we look forward to seeing you. So again, WPEO.com, 55th anniversary. All the information is on their website, and I think that would be great. Of course, for those of you out in California, because we will be talking about California in just a minute, KYCC will be up there as well. But I just thought I would mention that this is an opportunity for us to meet you and certainly to shake your hand and talk a little bit more about some of these issues. We'll take some phone calls in just a minute, but Bruce, let's at least talk about this. This was an interesting article by Andrew Stutford. The beatings will continue until the markets improve. The stock market took in a precipitous drop, 890 points on Monday, and a lot of that has to do with the tariffs, but it also has to do with a lot of things that happened 4 years before, not the least of which is just spending so much money, having to print so much money, and having the dollars in my bank account worth less than they were before. And that's another reason for why this gap, because if you have assets like if you have stock or you have Bitcoin or you have a house, those assets actually increase because it takes more dollars to buy them. But if you just have dollars like in a bank account, you're really losing out. And that's one of the reasons why I'm seeing a lot of reaction right now to the economic situation we find ourselves in.
No doubt about it. The tariffs, I think, have it's not just the tariffs, and as you mentioned, it is events happening before the kind of this just current moment or the current drop in the stock market. I think more than anything, markets don't like uncertainty.
Oh boy! Right,
and so they're just trying to figure out not are tariffs good or bad, and I think we could make a case that in most cases tariffs do make things more expensive for the consumer. There are rationales for tariffs for certain kinds of industries you want to strengthen at home. But I think more than anything, the markets are just trying to figure out where this is going to land, and that's leading to this volatility that we're seeing.
I've said that uncertainty is almost the death knell of the stock market, but I might also say for everybody that's in ministry right now, uncertainty also has been the death knell for giving, because people tend not to invest, but they also tend not to give when there's uncertainty. I think President Trump is trying to create some certainty. He's pretty much told you what he was going to do when he was candidate Trump, and he's now implementing much of that as well. But, of course, that gets us in Doge and a few other things, and our first caller wants to get into that. So let's get into that. We'll go to North Carolina, and Maddie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I just wanted to say how much I enjoy your program. Thank you so much for giving us information, enlighten us, and hope people will listen and try to learn from that. And I feel like that we all have the ability to be an Elon Musk, maybe not to that extent, but I think in America we have the opportunity to earn our goals if we try to, and if we don't expect somebody else to do it for us, I feel like we can do that. But you have to want to, you have to try to. And I think we all have that opportunity in America.
That's very good. Well, and again, that is something we've talked about. Just the other day, I mentioned Mike Rowe, Dirty Jobs, and he's been talking about recently that we have a skills gap. And that's really concerning because we got rid of shop classes and everything. And I'm talking to a mechanical engineer needing that. But he also says we have a will gap because we had, now the number's not as high, but it used to be 7 million young men of employment age 25 to 56 who were not working and not looking for work. And so I think Maddie is talking about another aspect of democratic capitalism. It works if we have a work ethic. It works if we've had a Protestant work ethic. It works if we're encouraged to actually go out and make something of ourselves and then receive the benefits of our hard work.
No doubt. I think it's still alive and well, and it's encouraging, even though folks are deciding not to work for various reasons. It's encouraging that we still have a nation where you can, if you want to stay at it, hand out those resumes and keep up with all the different options. I think these days the younger folks are telling me Craigslist can be a way to keep up with job opportunities. But it's still very much a society that offers opportunities for those who can and are willing to work hard.
Well, again, some people may not want to work because they're in that particular season of life, but we also have people proposing, we talked about this yesterday, universal basic income. And there was a study just done by the National Center for Economic Research that gave out $500 a month to individuals in Compton, California, thinking, well, then that would maybe free them up so they could go and better themselves. At the end, they concluded it really didn't make any difference. The only thing they noticed changed is they smoked more cigarettes.
Oh, goodness.
And they didn't save money, and they didn't go out there and decide to maybe learn. And you don't have to always go to college to learn. You can go to maybe just look at some YouTube videos and learn some skills. And it does seem to me that I've said before, my commentary coming out next week, it's a place for pastors and politicians and leaders of all sorts, maybe even parents, to just simply say it's time to get everybody back to work. And I think the pandemic changed some of that, don't you think?
I do. No doubt it had an effect. And I think the other thing we do in our work is it's very data driven. So we've been looking at the participation in the labor force.
That's right.
But
I
also,
saw that in there.
But we've also been looking at birth rates. And so when we think about productivity, right, and GDP growth comes from the number of workers and the productivity of those workers. And so the other headwind we have is not only folks deciding to stay out of the workforce for various reasons, but it's actually expecting fewer workers in the future.
Yes.
If we continue on the path we're on.
And again, we've talked about that, the fertility gap. Fortunately, Christians have more children than non-Christians, and even interesting enough, conservatives have more children than liberals, but nevertheless, that's the case. Since we're mentioning that, this report I have in front of me is on industrial policy. And when you have the desire to have the government create theoretically shovel-ready works, hasn't worked out so well. And one of those, which our listeners in California are well aware of, California high-speed rail. I mean, you even had the other day Bill Maher making jokes about this, that as much as maybe some people really thought high-speed rail would be helpful in the state of California, it has been really one of the biggest boondoggles ever, and you highlight that in your report.
We did. We wanted to pick a few case studies that either prove the case for industrial policy or proved against the case. And I think, the jury is out on if and when the California high-speed rail project will ever finish.
Yes.
But it's made clear to us through that case example that it's really hard for governments to manage a project like that in that scale and get it delivered on time and on budget.
Some of the other ones as well. And, of course, one of them gets into NASA. We just mentioned Elon Musk a minute ago. We simply have left a few astronauts stranded up there because we just said, I don't know if we want to do NASA, or we'll let NASA worry about whether or not we want to encourage individuals of different ethnic backgrounds to actually join with the team, and didn't really focus on the primary project. And so when you see some of the things that Elon Musk has done, even though right now they're wanting to torch Tesla cars and electrical charging stations and the rest, there have been some remarkable things that have taken place because individuals in the private sector have been willing to try to manage some of these projects. And so when we come back from the break, I want to talk about that, because even some of the successes we've had in government haven't been as successful as the ones that we've oftentimes seen in the private sector. So if you want to get something done, I don't know, hire Elon Musk, although there are some people that right now disagree with that. I think he is doing what he can to also bring some of those same ideas to the government that he brought to his various companies. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we have Bruce Shaw in studio with us for a few more minutes, Executive Director of the Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism at Georgetown Law. Don't forget, we're going to have Dr. Paul Barreca with us in studio. We'll be talking about some very important issues there as well. But Bruce, you have an article that we posted. It came out a year ago, and I thought it would be helpful. There are two kinds of companies, those that strengthen democratic capitalism and those that undermine it. To be fair, I probably spend more time talking about the ones that undermine undermine it. Stakeholder capitalism, the promotion of ESG and DEI and all sorts of woke ideas and the rest. Vivek Ramaswamy wrote an entire book on that subject. But your argument here is let's not be overly critical because some of these corporate boards actually can enhance the free market. And so, again, you're reminding us that we should support those kind of boards.
Well, that's right. And the idea behind the article is that often, social issues get wrapped into a corporate strategy or a corporate set of assumed responsibilities, and they don't really integrate. It's not something the company needs to comment on or worry about. However, there are two points we wanted to make in the article, and it's different than stakeholder capitalism, maybe in air quotes. And it's that social issues that are important to folks in communities where you operate actually are important to factor into your strategy.
That makes sense.
So it's not just altruistic. Keeping in touch with folks and understanding what is impacting them and their families and their communities is important. And the second is that if boards step back and take a longer-term view of their strategy, many of these issues might have an impact that aren't going to have an impact on the next quarterly earnings or the next year. But the longer-term view you take, the more of these stakeholder concerns you can incorporate, but integrate into your strategy and not just set aside for a PR firm to talk about or to, get into greenwashing or acting like you're doing things that you're not.
Yeah.
But really inform your strategy, and that'll actually help create more value for your shareholders too.
And again, being concerned about your local community or about an issue that is very connected to the strategy, the gift of the product or the service or whatever you might produce makes sense. But deciding that you're going to go woke, and we already have over the years have talked about how that hasn't worked out so well for Bud Light and hasn't worked out so well for Target and hasn't worked out for, I can make the long list, you know it as well as I do. And at the same time, I've been at shareholder meetings where sometimes they raise a legitimate concern, and sometimes they can say, well, maybe we can invest some of our corporate dollars to make the issue of poverty less of a problem in the community. Maybe we can provide some opportunities for underprivileged students to learn more about this so they could actually go to Texas A&M and get an engineering degree like you did or something like that. So there are things to implement, and I just wanted people to know that particular article exists. You may be on a board, you may know somebody's on the board here, and this one was in Fortune magazine, and I just thought a lot of people should see at least one of the things you've written about recently.
Well, thanks for pointing it out, and I do want to give credit where credit's due. Mr. Denny actually, after his corporate career, served on a number of corporate boards, and this is the question, is my company strengthening or undermining democratic capitalism? Is a question. If he were here with us today, he would say he wished that he had asked more on the board and asked, how can we factor this in, to our company's mission, not ignoring profit, keeping it right there, central, but how can we make our strategy stronger and our company healthier?
Let me just mention, too, if you go to the website right now, we have a button that says Watch or Listen. You may know somebody right now that's in the corporate world and needs to hear this and did not hear the interview, but you can send that on to them because, again, we have Bruce in studio, so you can watch it or listen to it. Either way, send it the podcast, and that is the case. But I would be remiss. I pulled up the debt clock here, and I know we need to talk about that at least once because if we want to actually guarantee the demise of the United States, democratic capitalism, and a free market, it is 36.58 trillion and counting. It just bothers me every time I see the debt clock because it just keeps clicking on there. And we have run up such a debt, I don't know how we're going to pay it back. They're talking about a Bitcoin strategic reserve. Maybe that's helpful, selling off some land, and maybe that's somewhat helpful. But the bottom line is we did it to ourselves, didn't we?
We did. We borrowed, and we didn't. We thought we could kick the can down the road.
Yes.
And the question is, how much longer can we do that? And one reason we wanted to focus on industrial policy this year, not only has there been a growth in industrial policy initiatives, but as you pointed out earlier, that's still a small percentage of our government spending. But just bringing the facts to bear on, how big a problem is this, and what potential solutions are there. And do politicians have do they believe the beliefs and the will, right, to make some hard decisions when it comes to managing this debt that just can't go on like it's going on for forever.
And again, even on the debt clock, you have the Doge clock, and I'll give credit where credit is due. There have been some very outrageous things spent, and our tax dollars have been used and misused in all sorts of ways. But if you really wanted to begin to address this issue of the national debt, you've got to come back to entitlement, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, maybe health and human services. And either Donald Trump has prohibited Elon Musk from looking at those, or in some cases, various agreements, treaties, and other things have prevented that. So I want people to understand that as excited as some people are about some of the cuts that have been made, and yet on the other side, people would ask as if we're on the edge of Armageddon here. These are really pretty small cuts when you're talking about the fact that, again, looking at the debt clock, tax revenue this year, $5 trillion. That sounds pretty good until you realize that the spending is $7 trillion. To zero the numbers out, imagine if you're making $50,000 a year, but every year you're spending $70,000 a year, and you've got a credit card debt of over $360,000. You'd say, I'm in a problem, and the government is in a problem.
And no matter if you're a fan of what Elon Musk is doing or you're not a fan, or you're from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, some of these issues are big enough to bring us together to solve it. Yeah. And this, you're highlighting one that is definitely big enough to bring us together.
So anyway, that's what we were talking about. And of course, I started the program, if you didn't have a chance to hear, by actually talking about the fact that the continuing resolution, just to keep the government open this time next week, was passed by the House just barely. And now it goes to the Senate, and we'll see where that is. You will notice, of course, on our website that we have created all sorts of opportunities for Take Action. Mine today on vaccines. The Take Action has to do with taxpayer funding of abortion. But let me, just before we run out of time, just mention that if you'd like to know a little bit more about Bruce Shaw or about the Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism at Georgetown Law, we have that link on the website. If you click it out, you will see then there's information about you, there's research, there's events, there's a place for students. Maybe you'd like to study some of this, and most importantly, if somebody would like to contact you and have you come and speak at a Chamber of Commerce or something like that, you're available, aren't you?
Happy to do it. Would look forward to it. Look forward to meeting any of your listeners who might like to learn more.
Well, again, Bruce Shaw is with us. We have his bio there. We have a link to that, and I think you will benefit from some of that information. Conversation. We'll probably have another one on this issue of democratic capitalism. If you'd like our booklet on democratic capitalism or a booklet on socialism, just send us an email, and we will send it back by email. If you'd like a printed copy, sometimes people like to have something printed, especially if they want to hand it to one of their kids. These kids go off to college, maybe not at Texas A&M, but a lot of other places. They come back hardcore socialist, and sometimes they need to know there's another answer to that question. So that is indeed the case. And as I just mentioned a minute ago, those of you in Central Illinois, WPEO.com is a place to go to sign up for that event, which we'll be doing with them in due course. So if you'd like to know more about that, all of that is available at the website at pointofview.net. When we come back, Dr. Paul Barreca with us. We're going to talk about educating pastors overseas. Also, I posted a column he did on, well, how will you participate in the Great Commission? I think you'll really enjoy that conversation. So let's take a break. You can visit the website, pointofview.net, find out more about our two guests, and we'll be back right after this.
If you appreciate the trustworthy news and biblical worldview that you hear on Point of View, would you consider joining our team, the Truth Team? Listeners like you have been the backbone of Point of View for 53 years. But today there are more voices competing for Americans' attention than ever before, and few of them are anchored to biblical truth. By joining Point of View's Truth Team, you can be an integral part of keeping truth on the air. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week. But you don't have to wait till then. You can join the Truth Team right now and help us get a head start on our $150,000 spring fundraising goal. If you appreciate Point of View, please join the Truth Team. Join today by visiting us online at pointofview.net or you can call toll-free 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we have in studio with us as well Dr. Paul Barreca, Executive Director of Fellowship International Mission, an individual you've known for some time because, first of all, he has been on the program. He's been a pastor of churches in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and New Jersey. We've talked about his books, Follow the Master, How Jesus Made Disciples, and Follow the Master, a discipleship course for growing Christians. And, of course, he's also been an individual that has been with us on all of our Point of View trips, and the latest one going to be at Greece. But, Paul, let's talk about why you're here, because just down the road is Dallas Theological Seminary. They just had their 100th anniversary, and I was at that event, and they are holding a missions conference, so that's why you're here.
That's right. Dallas does a unique thing. The students run the missions conference. It's called the World Evangelization Conference, and this year is the 75th WEC conference at Dallas Seminary, so they're all excited about that. They stop all their classes. All of the students have workshops and plenary sessions. We've been hearing in the sessions from a statistician and researcher from the IMB all about how we're counting people groups and which portions of the world are still unreached and where the gospel is most needed. It's been fascinating, and the students are just eager to learn about missions. And so FIM is there with a number of other mission organizations helping students to discover ways that they can connect with missionaries and perhaps even serve as a missionary on the foreign field.
I just mentioned, too, if you click on the button that says See More, and then underneath you, it takes you to FIM.org. And again, that is going to be something that you might want to check out if you want to become a missionary, support a missionary, or just if somebody would like to have you come and speak on that issue as well, because you're wearing your FIM. But anybody watching right now can see your logo there as well. So that is the case. I do want to mention, since I just mentioned in passing, our trip to Greece, and we have a number of individuals that are joining with us on a trip that first will be on bus. You fly over to Thessaloniki and you work your way down to Philippi, all the way down to Athens and Corinth. Then we get on a boat that takes us to Patmos and Ephesus and a few other places. And I've heard from you that even though I think we're getting full, there's still room if indeed somebody was still interested. And I did not know that until I talked to you just the other day.
That's right. I've been told by our travel coordinator that we have 4 spots left, and that would be for the land portion. We have to wait and see if we can get additional spots on the cruise, because after that first portion that you spoke of, departing from the U.S., from Dallas or wherever you might be, whatever airport works best for you, on May 17, and then over to Thessaloniki, and then traveling down south, which is the exact route that the Apostle Paul would have followed in Acts chapter 16, going over to Berea and then Thessalonica, and then traveling south and coming to Athens in Acts chapter 17. So we'll be tracing that journey and some amazing biblical places, but also historical places. You know, in the U.S., when something is a couple of hundred years old, we build a monument. We think it's pretty special. You know, in Greece, things are, 2,000 years old for sure. So, and we're pretty sure we can open up for the second portion as well, which is the Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea cruise. Right. And on that portion, Kerby, we're going to be visiting Santorini, Crete, Ephesus, Patmos, beautiful places, but also places of great biblical significance as we think about not only the Apostle Paul, but the Apostle John as well.
One of the things I love about these trips that we've taken is that sometimes when you go to Israel, when you go to Caesarea, places like that, or Capernaum, it sort of gives you an eye what it was like. But by the time you get to Jerusalem, you just have to sort of in your mind's eye think of what it's like. When you go to Greece, Philippi looks like Philippi. Corinth looks like Corinth. Ephesus looks like Ephesus. You can almost say we're literally walking where Paul was, and this is where these buildings were. And so I think it is really helpful. And the last time we did that, and that was years ago, we did it in reverse order. So I had to keep moving my axe the wrong way. This way now we go from the Macedonian call over to, of course, Philippi and Thessaloniki and all of those days, all the way down to Athens and Corinth. So I think you're going to really appreciate that if you're coming. If you're not, well, we'll do our best to try to educate you when we come back. So those are some topics that I thought we just might mention in passing. If you do want to know more, I guess the best thing to do is either contact you or just send an email to us at Point of View, because just about full, but I found out we had a space or two, so if you can join us, that would be the case. We also have posted, I think, Paul, a piece that you wrote a while back on how will you participate in the Great Commission. Just one of many of your articles, but it's just a reminder that as we're going to be talking about today, we have a real responsibility, whether you're a missionary or not, to go and preach the good news.
Absolutely. And that Great Commission is for all of us. As a director of a missionary agency, that's where we give ourselves to. And you know, there's something interesting connecting Dallas Seminary with this. As I was on the seminary campus in various buildings they have, for example, the Bailey Chapel and the Walvert Center, there are names all over Dallas Seminary and most seminaries as well. Some of them are the professors and the leaders, Louis Sperry Chafer and others. But a number of them are generous donors who had a burden to train young men to prepare for ministry. And that's a beautiful reflection of the tapestry of the local church and of the universal church. Some are called to go as missionaries, and FIM is helping to send them and take care of them and help them fulfill their ministry. But for every missionary on the field, there are usually, our numbers at FIM is usually about 10 to 15 churches and usually about 50 to 100 individual donors for every one of those missionaries. And without those donations and support partners and prayer partners, that just missions would not happen. And our Point of View listeners understand that well. And I know that we take very seriously this idea of helping out however the Lord has called us, whether as a goer or as a sender. We all have our part in doing that.
You think about that in the New Testament. Of course, we talk about the Bereans, examine the scriptures daily to see if what was true. You have in 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul talking about give, and to be a cheerful giver, and actually commends those who did give. So I hope that you will consider, as we oftentimes bring in front of you these different ministries, that you would not only support the local radio station that, of course, we talked today about WPEO, but also Point of View, but also these other ministries, because that's a work that you can be involved in as well. We come back from the break, though. Let's, if we can, you might even want to look up Colossians 2, verses 6 and 7, because what we are calling for is the church to have mature disciples. And certainly one person that has written about this is Dr. Paul Barreca in his books on things about how Jesus made disciples and a discipleship course. But what about overseas? You've heard us talk about the need for us to have trained pastors overseas. And in the past, we've used a model where we bring them over here. And of course, I've met many of them at Dallas Theological Seminary. But I think it makes more sense, and we're going to be talking about this after the break, to send our people over there and train them as indigenous leaders. And we'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of all of that with Dr. Paul Barreca. If you'd like to know more about him or about Fellowship International Mission, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Healthcare officials warned that vaccine hesitancy is one of the top health challenges of this decade. It appears that both sides of the vaccine debate seem to be painting with too broad a brush. Most parents routinely have their physician give their child an MMR vaccine. At the same time, those same parents may express concerns about giving their child the COVID-19 vaccine. Unfortunately, they are often labeled anti-vax and blamed for the latest measles outbreak in the U.S. It is true that the percentage of children receiving 2 doses of MMR vaccine dropped a bit, but there are other factors such as the measles spreading from unvaccinated travelers or even undocumented immigrants. Parents who vaccinate their children but express concerns about the COVID vaccine should not be called anti-vax. Likewise, parents shouldn't refuse all vaccines simply because of the legitimate concerns about the COVID vaccine. By now, you may be wondering why I say there are legitimate concerns with the COVID vaccine. Well, a recent Yale study has confirmed what many suspected and has been referred to as post-vaccination syndrome. The COVID vaccine in a small number of people may have led to a constellation of side effects. These include fatigue, exercise intolerance, brain fog, and dizziness. Some people show distinct biological changes in immune cells, reawakening of a dormant Epstein-Barr virus, and the persistence of a coronavirus protein in their blood. While this is just a small study, it highlights the potential health concerns and calls into question the efficacy of the COVID vaccine. That is why many parents are concerned about the vaccine and why some states have banned vaccine mandates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In studio with us today, Dr. Paul Barreca, as we talk about missions, and in particular, what within the body of Christ we desperately need, and that is the elders and pastors who are going to be theologically trained. Up until now, oftentimes we said, let's bring them over to this country, and I think there is a better model with that. But first of all, one of the things, Paul, that you suggested is that we look at Colossians 2, verses 6 and 7.
Absolutely. One of the many references about the gospel going forth, and that passage says this: "Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, and established in the faith, just as you were taught." And if we're going to see spiritually mature, reproducing disciples of Jesus around the world, we certainly have to go and bring the gospel. And that's, we think about that as missions, and we think about the missionary sharing the gospel and, going different places where the gospel's not been heard. But then those who believe, we have to help them to be built up in their faith. And that's the role of the local church and of pastors. And so therefore, an important part of the missiological picture is theological training for the leaders and the pastors.
And again, let's help people understand the need, and it's best illustrated by whenever I've had somebody here from, say, E3 Partners or East-West Ministry or a variety of others that have any kind of short-term missions. Oftentimes I say, look, what you already have sitting in the pew in your church is probably as much, if not more, than most of the people that are given the role of pastor in their local small church. So it illustrates again, number one, you shouldn't be hesitant about going and sharing the gospel wherever God may take you. And short-term missions has been a wonderful opportunity, in large part because of the airplanes. I know in the old days that wasn't really possible when you'd have to get on a tramp steamer for many months to try to make your way to Africa, Asia, whatever it might be. But now that's a possibility. But it brings us back to the key issue. We need mature Christian leaders, and we need to train them. And the model that we've used in the past still works, but there's a better way to do it, isn't there?
Yes, in the past, the model has, when I say in the past, 20, 30, 40 years, bring the key leaders from the developing church in the mission field, Nigeria, South America, Brazil, wherever, bring them here to the U.S., the sharp ones, so that they can be trained at some of our seminaries like Southern and Dallas Theological Seminary, great places where they're going to receive training. The problem with that, and I just have a 2022 research article from Anthony Casey, and here's the statistics. Roughly half of those students stay in the U.S. after graduation. And what we have, Kerby, is we have kind of a brain drain. With the best of intentions, we end up pulling the sharpest theologians away from the countries that they really should be serving. And so what we are seeing is a shift in the missiological and the theological training, where we're seeing an explosion, a preponderance of seminaries and Bible colleges on the mission field being led by individuals from that country, and sometimes augmented by U.S. professors as well. I get to do that. You've done that many times before as well. And it's a really beautiful picture, and it can be really, really helpful to the church, because we want those indigenous leaders to be the ones training the pastors.
Well, and again, let's just talk about that for a minute, because you and I at different times have actually taught at Word of Life in the Philippines, Word of Life in Hungary. Of course, you've taught in some other places of Word of Life as well. And so what you're in many cases doing is, in that case, more of it's a sort of a Bible college, but it's still, these are going to be future leaders. And I can point to a leader that's in Romania that was one of my students in Hungary, and you and I can both point to individuals we've known over the years that have gone on to actually provide leadership at Word of Life. And there's just a real need to keep the individuals there. They know the language. I don't know Tagalog in the Philippines. I guarantee you neither of us know Hungarian.
Yes.
Hungarian may be one of the hardest languages in the world, but they do, and they're already there. They know the culture. Now they have the training. They can make a difference, right?
Absolutely, they can. And, some of the things that are happening, one example that I can think of is the church in Nigeria. The church in Nigeria is called ECWA, Evangelical Church Winning All. They are the churches that were established by Sudan Interior Missions and then became autonomous and kind of took control of that themselves. They have 6 seminaries throughout Nigeria. And some of our missionaries are training in some of those seminaries. By the way, we need to pray for them. There's great persecution.
Yes.
And one of my missionaries knows personally a number of his students that have been killed and martyred by the Fulani attacks that are going on in Nigeria. But these servants and these believers at great personal cost, and get a load of this, a semester for a student there is $50.
Yes.
And they can't come up with it.
Yes.
Because there's such economic depravity and just hardship because of the persecution. And so we have believers here that are raising funds and helping those friends in Nigeria. But the church has the church has the enthusiasm, they have the willingness. They just need some support and sometimes some logistic help as well.
Some of them don't even have access to a Bible, or if they do, one that we would like to give to them. We're having more and more of these Bibles. Gene Getz first started it, and now you can see Tony Evans and a variety of others have it, where they then have a QR code because they may not have a lot, but they almost always have a phone.
Yes.
And if they can then get the QR code, it takes them then to a YouTube video for the training. So this high-tech way in which we are now educating individuals, they can, with their Bible and with their phone, get really what is pretty close to a seminary education. And it's just amazing what the technology has provided us.
There's some other technologies. One is Mega Voice, which is a little handheld device. Kind of looks like a small, old-fashioned cell phone, not a smartphone. But that can be preloaded in any number of languages. Some of them are solar, so that if you're in a place that there is no, power, they are getting these into even North Korea. One of our missionaries is involved in that endeavor. They're getting them into places where you would think that they might not be able to go, but getting the Word of God, and it's not just Scripture on there. Sometimes it's the Jesus film, and sometimes it's biblical training, hermeneutics, and Bible study, and how to preach, and different doctrine, and things of this nature. So it is a global effort. In the missiological world, there are researchers, there are authors, there are those who go as missionaries, and it's a beautiful, complex picture of the church working together to continue to accomplish this task of the Great Commission.
One of the things you talked about is being outside of North Korea but getting it in. A while back, we raised some funds for the Iranian Bible College, and people say, well, is that in Iran? No. What they do is they sneak some of those individuals across the border, and they're educated there. So even when we talk about taking them from their circumstance, we don't have to bring them to the United States. Sometimes we just bring them into the next free country where we can have some of the training that takes place. And when you're talking about trying to reach North Korea, not an easy place for anybody with a missionary pass to get into, obviously. So that is the case. So I do want to take some time also to talk about some of the negative aspects, but you're starting to see more and more of these Bible institutes growing up. So again, if that institute exists in that country, you can take some of your key speakers, put them on an airplane, and they can teach in that Bible institute, can't they?
Yes, indeed. And in fact, I was just talking to some students today at Dallas that said, hey, I want to get out and teach. How can I do that? And one of the young men I was talking to said, well, contact your missionaries from your church. They probably have some sessions and Bible schools and other things that they're doing. And, we see a lot of pastors, and you and I have, much contact with these pastors. A lot of pastors really have this idea of stewardship. We've been given so much. And for me, for 30 years in ministry, almost every year I would go overseas. Yeah. The church took it on as a responsibility to share their pastor. And they would send me to, whether it was Word of Life or Nigeria or some other place, to share the word, and the folks there are so appreciative, receptive.
Yes, they are.
And it really means the world to them.
Let's take a break, and let me open up the phones. You maybe have some thoughts about missions, may have some thoughts about your own short-term mission trip, or what your pastor does, or what your missions conference does. When we come back, I do want to talk about some of the negatives, because we illustrated one of those, and that is the brain drain, but there's some other issues we haven't addressed. And if you find yourself saying, well, my goodness, I would really like to get Bruce or some of the other individuals that we've had a chance to hear. We talked about Bruce Shaw. If you would like to have him come and speak maybe to a Chamber of Commerce, if you'd like to have Paul come and speak to your mission conference, those are individuals we're highlighting today on Point of View. If you'd like to read one of the articles by Bruce Shaw, that's up there. The article by Paul Barreca is up there. So just a lot of great material that you will find helpful. And again, we've got a couple of the booklets available on the website. We'll be back right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're talking with Dr. Paul Barreca, and we'll get into everything from the Great Commission to the training of pastors and much more. But if you'd like to join us, love to get your comments. That number, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. As we were going out to the break, I just noticed that some of you might want the booklets we mentioned last hour, A Biblical View on Socialism, A Biblical View on Capitalism and Socialism. Karen jumped right in and actually posted those, so there is an opportunity right now for you to download those two. So that is so easy. Some of you might say, well, I was meaning to call or write or send an email asking for them. Well, they are actually there. So the interview that we did with Bruce Shaw and the articles and the booklets we made available to you, which we make available to those of you that support this ministry on a regular basis. If you give as little as $1 a day, $30 a month or more, you then are part of the Truth Team. And of course, we have our Anchor to Truth banner up there, which we will be talking about later this month. And also we'll be getting into some of the action items. But Paul, let me come back to you, because as we talk about the education overseas, you have the Bible Institutes, but I left out the obvious one, and that is seminaries. You're at Dallas Seminary right now, and they have extensions in many places around the world.
That's right. So some seminaries like Dallas and some of the Southern Baptist seminaries have opened up overseas locations where they are able to train national leaders and help them develop. And the idea at a seminary level is not just training the pastors, but at the seminary level, you're looking at training those who will be the trainers of the pastors.
Right.
And we need those as well. We need real academic individuals in those countries to do the academic work, to learn the Greek and the Hebrew and the archaeology and the apologetics and all of those aspects that are so very important. And don't forget, in these cultures, we're dealing with some unique apologetics challenges as well, whether it be Hinduism or Islam or animism or any other number of world religions. And these leaders are confronting this, these pastors are confronting this on an everyday basis. And so they need resources in their language. They need trainers in their language who are going to be able to help those pastors. And it's so much more effective when those who are doing the training of the local pastors there know the culture, know the language, know the nuances. And so that's why we've seen Dallas and some of these other seminaries start extension locations in those other countries.
Well, you mentioned that. I'll just hold up our latest booklet we just sent out is on Hinduism for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's amazing how many Hindus we have in the government right now, and I've mentioned that. But again, it is very significant. If you consider Christianity the largest religion, Islam the second largest, and of course we have a booklet on that, Hinduism is the third largest religion, and those are things to be aware of. And if you're going to be a missionary, whether it's full-time with, for example, FIM, or even just going on short-term mission trip, learning about some of that is very helpful, and that's why we have provided some of those booklets. Okay, we talked about one negative, the brain drain. There's another big negative, which I never really thought about until I read some of your outline.
Yes, it would be great if there were funds. I don't always think it's the best strategy, but let's say there is a key leader and you need to bring them here to the U.S. to be at a key seminary location. Well, there's not really, those places don't have tons of scholarships available. Some of them do. And, I've got some connections with Liberty University and, of course, DTS and some other places. There's some funds, but generally they have to raise a good bit of money. But you know who is giving free academic ride? And it is Princeton, Union Theological Seminary, Harvard, and they're getting these international leaders, and I have some personal knowledge from Nigeria. They're getting these Nigerian pastors, Nigerian seminarians to come, and they say, oh, wow, I've got a scholarship to Princeton. Wonderful. No, not wonderful, because they take these guys and they fill them with all of this Marxist and really atheistic view of the Bible, and naturalistic view of the Bible. And then they go back to these countries and they destroy the seminaries and the Bible training there. So we have to be very careful warning our friends from Africa, from South America, from Asia. Don't accept those free invitations. They don't know what Princeton stands for today. They don't know what Union stands for today. So we have to really guard against that, because there's a lot of corruption that comes in through these liberal seminaries.
Well, again, that's the problem. They return back with a liberal viewpoint. And as you said, it's not just damaging to the church, it's damaging sometimes to the entire culture, and it sets the church back. So if we're really kind of looking to the future of making a difference, that is the case. When you wrote this piece on how will you participate in the Great Commission, it brings us back to, okay, maybe you can go and teach in a Bible school, or at least go involved in a short-term missions. But there are some other ways, even in our own communities, that we can fulfill the Great Commission, right?
I learned just yesterday that there is a huge Hindu population in Frisco, Texas. Who'd have thunk? I mean, you know, and just about everywhere. We have missionaries from FIM in Tampa, Florida. Tampa is the largest Muslim population in the U.S. It used to be Dearborn. Now it's Tampa. There's a mosque of 10,000 that's to accommodate 10,000 people in Tampa. So we don't have to necessarily go around the world. Sometimes we just have to go around the block and get to meet some of these folks. And there is a challenge to that. I mean, I love the fact that on Point of View we've got a lot of political commentary, and we talk about what's happening in politics. We have to, kind of separate our political ideas from our spiritual concerns. I'm quite concerned about Islam and what's happening globally, but I need to be concerned for my Muslim neighbor on a human level.
Right.
And remember that that's someone who's got a very, very different worldview and does some things strange and celebrates holidays strange and certainly is apart from the gospel. We don't need political arguments in that kind of situation.
Well said.
We need love. We need compassion. We need to get to know our neighbors. We need to build bridges. We need to have coach their kids on the soccer team and all of those things, because it is that kind of compassion, Christian compassion, that breaks down those barriers. And I think those of us who are conservative Christians, we have to constantly remind ourselves to separate our worldview and our political views and all of that, and to get a gospel focus on our neighbors. We've got one of our missionaries, a young man named Ben, and one of the things I appreciate about him so much is that he just is so concerned. Every time he sees somebody, he's thinking, how can I share the gospel with that person? This kid's 25 years old. Brings conviction to my old heart, because I need to be more like that, and I think we all do.
Well, and you brought up a good point, because when I've spoken here in Dallas, I have some slides that pop up on the number, and I always shock people, the number of Hindu temples that are in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, the number of Buddhist temples. Of course, you can also do the number of mosques and the estimated population. So you remember Rudyard Kipling said, "East is east and west is west." No longer. The East has come over here. You can actually be a missionary by walking across the street. And right. In my neighborhood, I have a lot of individuals from India. Some are Hindu, some are just maybe kind of culturally Hindu. I have Muslims in my neighborhood, and it's very obvious right now, since we're in Ramadan, we will see on the door there all sorts of things, Ramadan Kareem, or a variety of others that are actually practicing, others that I'm pretty sure are Muslim but don't seem to be practicing, or at least keeping a low profile. And so, again, you should not be surprised that you are in a sense of a universe of worldviews, a universe of world religions next door, which is why we have these booklets on things like what have been the most effective strategies to witness to your Muslim friends? What are some of the issues you might want to raise if you're talking to a Hindu? And a lot of that came up because I mentioned earlier WPEO, but last time I was at WPEO, one of the questions from the audience was, I just had somebody come in and I'm pretty sure he's Hindu, and how would I witness to him? And I thought, well, probably a good idea to do a booklet on that. And then when we started looking at the second lady, she is Usha Vance. She's Hindu. Mm-hmm. Tulsi Gabbard, she is Hindu. You have others that have come from kind of a Hindu background, Vivek Ramaswamy, and I can make the list pretty long there of those individuals. And so these are individuals that you can witness to. So if you want to fulfill the Great Commission, just walk across the street. Just get to know your neighbors. And as Paul said, as political as we are around here, they need to know the gospel, and we don't need to get into all sorts of political fights because those are going to be a distraction from really the important issues. Come back. We'll take a phone call or two if you would like to join us, and then we'll just wind down some of the issues we've been talking about today. Dr. Paul Barreca, Executive Director of the Fellowship International Mission. If you click on his picture and scroll down, you will see that it will take you to FIM.org, and that is a way in which you can then find out about becoming a missionary, maybe even supporting a missionary. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we'll talk with one of you in just a minute as we'll take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Paul Barreca in studio, but I thought I might just mention that Fellowship International Mission is in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And so if you ever want to visit them, but if you'd like to contact them, we have that information. And I know you're coming up to an anniversary and you're going to do some refurbishing of your facility there as well, aren't you?
That's right. It's the 75th anniversary this year for Fellowship International Mission. So you and Suzanne are invited to the 75th anniversary banquet in November. We'll talk about that. Hopefully you can come. But it's a great time for us as an organization to celebrate. You know, that 75 to 100 years, that's when so many Bible colleges.
That's right.
And non-denominational churches, seminaries, Dallas Seminary, 100 years, because that's when liberalism was coming into the church. You think about like G. Gresham Machen writing about the fundamentals of the faith, because the mainline denominations were all departing from the faith.
Yeah.
And so FIM we're a part of that heritage as well. And in fact, our first missionaries were in Morocco.
I did not know that.
That's how FIM got started. Now we have missionaries in 31 countries. And also we have our largest number of missionaries ever in the 75 years, which is pretty exciting
I think so.
for our mission organization.
Again, if you want to look it up, it's called the Fundamentalist Modernist Controversy.
Yes.
And that's when a lot of these great institutions were birthed, because there was a turning away from the faith. And of course, we've already mentioned some that have turned away and stayed away, and that was Harvard, Union, Princeton, the rest. Let's take some phone calls, though. We'll go to Texas. First of all, Gary, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, I have a question about a method that to reach everyone by saturation mail, a apologetic brochure that would reach 128.7 million households in the United States, and to be financed by local churches in their own zip code. It would cost a maximum of 40 cents a household, and the Lord would like for everyone to know, whether they accept Him or not, about Him. And it would place that in their hands all over the United States. And it could be done if it's done with archaeological creation, science, and all the evidence, plus the gospel message. And it would be a way that we could reach this nation for the Lord. What do you think about that?
I think it's an idea that we really need to get maybe like a Lee Strobel or somebody kind of taking the lead on that, because I think that has some great possibility. Of course, Sean McDowell was on last week and some others, but some people that have some kind of national platform, or even, of course, recently we've talked about, matter of fact, this week we talked about the people at Coral Ridge. They do Evangelism Explosion. I think if we can get somebody that has sort of a national network and some kind of national visibility, that might have some real possibilities. So, Gary, I think you're onto something.
Well, I pray so. I know it's the Lord's heart, whether people accept Him or not, just to have the opportunity. And I think it's affordable if we divide the cost among churches and zip codes, and that's only media that can reach everyone. You can't do it on radio or TV or internet sites because it's so scattered. But that's the only complete way to reach every household. But we'll pray about it. I guess that's the answer.
Well, Gary, appreciate you bringing that up. And, there are ways to reach individuals. Of course, face-to-face, door-to-door is very good. But we recognize the value of media, but there is nothing better than getting something in their hands and then following up,
What Gary said is kind of interesting. It kind of follows the Billy Graham model of getting local churches involved in the Crusades back in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And so if you can get local churches involved in distributing literature to their zip codes, wow, what a great idea. I'd like to learn more about that, and maybe we can find out.
Maybe Franklin Graham would be someone in that regard. Just today, matter of fact, over in my car, I have the leftovers of the Decision magazine where I wrote some things about the Periscope material that we do at Probe and all of that, and I'm thinking there's something to that. I will be at an event soon. It's an event related to Evantel, and we got Lee Strobel there. Maybe we can bring that up if I have a chance to talk to him. So, great idea, and it's certainly the case. But it brings us back to the key issue, whether we are going to go overseas or whether we're just going to walk across the street. It seems to me that one of the greatest needs we have right now is to fulfill the Great Commission. And we are told in Matthew 24 that every nation will hear. Some people actually seem to argue that, well, the rapture can't come, Jesus can't come until every unidentified or even identified and unreached people group is touched. But I think when it talks about nations, we have done a pretty good job already, but the church needs to do a lot more in terms of fulfilling the Great Commission.
Yes, and in missions, we talk about unreached people group. There are still over 6,000 ethnic groups, which is a group combined by either language or living in a particular location, particular cultural distinctives. over 6,000 groups with no gospel witness.
Wow.
And so that's a great task for us as believers, and even just listening to this today, for us to be focused in prayer, asking the Lord to help us to reach our Jerusalem, but also for this work that's going around, going global, taking the gospel in whatever means we can, whether it's electronic, but it really involves putting on our shoes, tying up our laces, and getting involved in loving people and sharing the good news of the gospel.
Glad you mentioned Jerusalem, because if you go back to Acts 1:8, he talks about Judea and Samaria and the uttermost parts of the earth, and we sort of have this idea that missionaries are the ones that put on the pith helmet and they go overseas and they live there and they learn the language, and as important as those people are, the people here are. But for just a minute, talk, if you might, Paul, about what it might be to be a missionary, because one of the things I love about Fellowship International Mission is if somebody says, I've had a heart for this unreached people group, and I have connections to that, maybe through my church, or maybe I grew up there and I know that language. Sometimes trying to fit in with the other mission groups is hard, but you actually have been very flexible over the years in actually bringing missionaries onto the field, haven't you?
Yes, we have, because FIM focuses on helping the missionary fulfill their call. Kerby, most missionaries, there's two very popular ones. One is MKs. They often become missionaries themselves. But the other is most missionaries took a short-term trip,
right?
Maybe with their church, maybe with their Bible college or something like that. And we can even accommodate folks that might want to be able to do something like that on a short-term trip, and hooking them up perhaps with one of our missionaries. We have a number of college kids going out this summer. I just spoke to someone this morning, approved her to go to Greece, and she's going to be working with some of our missionaries there in Greece. And just challenging to think about missions, just to get that exposure and let the Lord direct in your heart.
Let me again send you to fim.org. There's a button there that says Become a Missionary, and maybe you're thinking about that. And even as we've talked about this today, you've said, well, maybe that's something God is calling me to do. Or you say, no, but I think I could support a missionary. You click on that button, says Support a Missionary, and then there's a way in which you can maybe get behind an individual that is giving, that you can give to, that's already engaged in some aspect of ministry that God may be calling you to. So I'm so grateful that you were at the missions conference at Dallas Theological Seminary, and I guess we're going to have you back to talk about that 75th anniversary there of FIM. But thank you for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you and Kim. Probably, I guess the next time I see you is in Greece.
That's right, in Thessaloniki. So.
That's amazing.
Yes.
Well, that's all we have for today. And let me just mention tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable. And then, of course, Friday, without a doubt, of course, is our weekend edition. So if you would like to know a little bit more, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. As I mentioned before, we have those booklets, which are at the very end. So if you had said, oh, I'd like to get those, just click on those, download them, and you have what you need. That's all we have for today. Megan, thank you for engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Looking forward to our program tomorrow and our Millennial Roundtable. We'll see you back there right here on Point of View.
If you appreciate the trustworthy news and biblical worldview that you hear on Point of View, would you consider joining our team, the Truth Team? Listeners like you have been the backbone of Point of View for 53 years. But today there are more voices competing for Americans' attention than ever before, and few of them are anchored to biblical truth. By joining Point of View's Truth Team, you can be an integral part of keeping truth on the air. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week. But you don't have to wait till then. You can join the Truth Team right now and help us get a head start on our $150,000 spring fundraising goal. If you appreciate Point of View, please join the Truth Team. Join today by visiting us online at pointofview.net. Or you can call toll-free 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate point of view. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have point of view? And come on, guys, give something to point of view to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.